The hammer struck the final nail with a hollow thud that echoed across the desolate prairie. Jack Morrison wiped the sweat from his weathered brow and stared down at the pine coffin he'd been crafting for 3 days straight. His own coffin. The tuberculosis had been eating away at his lungs for months, and he could feel death creeping closer with each rattling cough that shook his frail frame. But as he stood there in the fading light, 4 shadows emerged from the tall grass like ghosts from a forgotten nightmare. Children, starving. Their hollow eyes burned with desperation as they stumbled toward his cabin, their skeletal hands reaching out in silent plea. Jack's hand instinctively moved to his Colt revolver, but something in their faces stopped him cold. These weren't ordinary children lost on the frontier. The terror in their eyes spoke of something far more dangerous pursuing them. And in that moment, as the wind carried the distant sound of approaching hoofbeats, Jack realized his coffin might not be for him after all. But what happened next would silence the entire prairie and force a dying man to choose between his final days of peace and a fight that could cost him everything. 24 hours earlier, Jack Morrison had awakened to another morning of solitude in his ramshackle cabin, 15 miles from the nearest settlement. The isolation suited him perfectly. Out here, nobody could hear his violent coughing fits or see the blood he spat into his handkerchief. Out here, he could die with the dignity a man deserved. He'd spent his 43 years as a drifter, moving from ranch to ranch, town to town, never staying long enough to form attachments or leave behind regrets. But the consumption had finally caught up with him, and this remote patch of Nebraska grassland would be his final stop. Jack had chosen this place carefully, far enough from civilization that his death wouldn't burden anyone, yet close enough to a small creek that he could sustain himself in his final weeks. He'd built the cabin with his own hands, each board cut and fitted with the meticulous care of a man who knew it would be his last construction project. The irony wasn't lost on him that after a lifetime of building homes for other people, his final creation would be his own tomb. He'd calculated everything perfectly. Enough supplies for 2 months, enough laudanum to dull the pain, and enough whiskey to make the end bearable. But as he worked on his coffin each day, measuring and cutting the pine boards with the same precision he'd once used to build schoolhouses and churches, Jack found an unexpected peace in preparing for his own mortality. The morning sun cast long shadows across his small garden as he tended to the vegetables that would outlive him. His movements were slow and deliberate, conserving what little strength remained in his wasting body. The cough came in violent waves now, leaving him gasping and weak, but he refused to surrender to self-pity. He'd lived by his own terms, and he would die the same way. As he worked, his mind drifted to the letters he'd never written, the apologies he'd never made, the love he'd never allowed himself to feel. Sarah McKenzie's face floated through his memory, the school teacher from Kansas who'd tried to convince him to settle down 15 years ago. He'd walked away from her, just like he'd walked away from everything good in his life, convinced that a man like him wasn't meant for happiness. Now, as death approached with the inevitability of winter, he wondered if his fierce independence had been wisdom or cowardice. But it was too late for such reflections. His path was chosen, his fate sealed. All that remained was to finish his coffin and wait for the end with whatever dignity he could muster. The tuberculosis had given him a timeline, and he intended to meet it on his own terms, alone and unburdened by the complications that came with caring for others. But his carefully planned solitude shattered like glass when 4 small figures emerged from the prairie grass that evening, stumbling towards his cabin with the desperation of the truly lost. Jack set down his tools and studied them carefully as they approached. The oldest couldn't have been more than 12, a boy with sandy hair and eyes that had seen too much suffering for his young age. Behind him came two girls, perhaps 8 and 10, their dresses torn and filthy, clinging to each other with the fierce protectiveness of sisters. The youngest was barely more than a toddler, a boy of maybe 4, whose tear-stained face spoke of hunger and terror beyond his comprehension. They moved with the careful hesitation of wild animals approaching a potential threat, ready to bolt at the first sign of danger. But it was their eyes that struck Jack most profoundly, hollow and desperate.
"Mister," the oldest boy called out, his voice barely above a whisper. "We ain't eaten in 3 days. Our ma, she told us to find help before she—" His voice broke, and Jack felt something twist in his chest that had nothing to do with his disease. These children were orphans now, abandoned on the vast prairie with nowhere to turn and no one to protect them. The civilized thing would be to direct them to the nearest town, to let the authorities handle their care. But Jack could see the exhaustion in their small bodies, the way they swayed on their feet from hunger and fatigue. They wouldn't survive another 15-mile trek to civilization. Against every instinct of self-preservation he'd cultivated over 4 decades, Jack found himself stepping forward. "Come inside," he heard himself say, his voice rough with more than just illness. "There's stew on the stove." The relief that flooded their faces was almost painful to witness. As they stumbled into his cabin, Jack felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders like a heavy coat. These children needed more than a meal. They needed protection, guidance, and care that would extend far beyond his remaining weeks on Earth. The oldest boy, who introduced himself as Thomas, explained their story in halting words between desperate spoonfuls of stew. Their parents had died in a cholera outbreak that swept through their settlement. The surviving adults had scattered, taken what they could carry, and leaving the children to fend for themselves. They'd been walking for days, sleeping in tall grass and drinking from muddy streams, following rumors of a town to the north where they might find refuge. But they were lost now, weak and starving, with winter approaching and no clear destination in sight. As Jack listened to their story, he felt his carefully constructed plans for a peaceful death crumbling around him. These children needed him, and despite his determination to die alone, he couldn't bring himself to turn them away. But his kindness would soon summon something far greater than gratitude and far more dangerous than he could possibly imagine. The children's presence transformed Jack's cabin overnight from a tomb into a sanctuary. He gave them his bed while he slept on the floor, his aching bones protesting against the hard wooden planks. Little Samuel, the youngest, had nightmares that left him sobbing in the darkness, and Jack found himself sitting beside the child, humming half-remembered lullabies his own mother had sung decades ago. The girls, Mary and Ruth, tried to help with cooking and cleaning despite their weakness, their innate politeness a heartbreaking reminder of the civilized life they'd lost. But it was Thomas who worried Jack most. The boy carried himself with the premature responsibility of someone forced to become a man too soon, his young shoulders bent under the weight of protecting his siblings. During the day, Jack shared his meager supplies while secretly rationing his own portions. He taught them to fish in the creek and identify edible plants, skills that might keep him alive if something happened to him. But with each passing hour, he could feel his strength ebbing away more rapidly. The stress of caring for 4 children was accelerating his decline, and he knew his time was running shorter than he'd planned. Still, he couldn't bring himself to regret his decision. For the first time in years, his cabin echoed with voices other than his own violent coughing. The children's laughter, rare as it was, filled spaces in his heart he'd forgotten existed. But their safety was precarious, dependent entirely on his failing health and dwindling supplies. 3 days after their arrival, Jack's worst fears materialized in the form of dust clouds on the horizon. He'd been teaching the children to milk his stubborn old cow when Thomas grabbed his arm, pointing toward the approaching riders. "Mr. Jack," the boy whispered, his face pale with recognition. "Those men, they came to our settlement before the sickness. They ain't good people." Jack counted at least 8 riders, their silhouettes dark against the afternoon sky. Even from a distance, he could see the predatory way they moved, circling his property like wolves sizing up prey. These weren't lawmen or settlers. They had the bearing of men who took what they wanted and killed anyone who stood in their way. As the riders drew closer, Jack could make out their leader, a tall man with a silver mustache and cold eyes that seemed to catalog every weakness, every vulnerability. The man's gaze lingered on the children with an interest that made Jack's blood run cold. He'd heard stories of such men, raiders who trafficked in human misery, selling children to brothels and factories where their small hands were valued more than their lives. The other riders spread out in a semicircle, cutting off any possible escape routes. Their horses snorted and stamped, sensing the tension that crackled through the air like electricity before a thunderstorm. Jack felt his hand move instinctively to his revolver, but he was one sick man against 8 armed predators. The odds were impossible, the outcome inevitable. But as he looked at the terror in the children's faces, Jack Morrison made a decision that would define the final chapter of his life. "You children get inside," Jack said quietly, his voice carrying an authority he hadn't used in years. "Whatever happens, you stay hidden until I tell you it's safe." Thomas started to protest, but Jack cut him off with a look. "This ain't a discussion, boy. You're the man of your family now. Protect your siblings." The children reluctantly obeyed, disappearing into the cabin while Jack stepped out to meet his visitors. The leader of the group dismounted with casual confidence, his spurs jingling as he approached. Up close, Jack could see the cruelty etched in the man's weathered features, the kind of face that belonged to someone who'd forgotten what mercy looked like. "Afternoon," the stranger said, tipping his hat in mock politeness. "Name's Colonel Pierce. We're looking for some lost children. Heard they might have wandered this way." Jack's expression remained neutral despite the rage building in his chest. "Haven't seen any children," he replied. "Just me and my land out here." Pierce smiled, but it was the cold smile of a snake preparing to strike. "Now that's funny," he drawled, "because we followed their tracks right to your door. Small feet in the mud by your creek. Fresh bread cooling on your windowsill. Sounds like someone's been feeding hungry mouths." The other riders shifted in their saddles, hands moving closer to their weapons. Jack could feel the weight of their stares, calculating his weaknesses, measuring his resolve. He knew he was dying, but these men didn't need to know that. As far as they could tell, he was just another frontier hermit with a gun and the will to use it. "Even if there were children here," Jack said carefully, "what business would that be of yours?" Pierce's smile widened, revealing teeth stained yellow from tobacco. "Those children belong to us," he said with casual certainty. "Their parents owed us a considerable debt before they died. The children are our collateral." It was a lie, and they both knew it, but Pierce delivered it with the confidence of a man accustomed to having his version of truth accepted without question. Jack felt his finger tighten on his gun, but he forced himself to remain calm. One wrong move, and he'd be dead before he could draw, leaving the children defenseless. "Debt don't pass to children," Jack replied. "Not in any law I know." Pierce chuckled, a sound like gravel in a tin cup. "Out here, we make our own laws. Now you can hand 'em over peaceful-like, or we can take 'em anyway. Your choice." The standoff stretched between them like a taut wire ready to snap. Jack could hear the children whispering anxiously inside the cabin, could feel their terror seeping through the wooden walls.
He thought of Thomas trying to be brave, of little Samuel's nightmares, of Mary and Ruth clinging to each other in fear. These predators would destroy them, body and soul, for nothing more than profit. But Jack Morrison had spent 43 years running from responsibility, from attachment, from anything that might require him to sacrifice for others. Today, with death already claiming his body, he finally found something worth fighting for. And in that moment of crystalline clarity, "I got a counteroffer," Jack said, his voice deadly quiet. "You and your boys turn around and ride away. Forget you ever heard of any children. Consider it the charitable thing to do." Pierce's laughter was harsh and mocking. "You're one sick old man against 8 of us. What makes you think you got any leverage in this negotiation?" Jack's hand moved to his shirt, revealing something that made Pierce's expression change instantly. A silver star, tarnished but unmistakable, pinned to his chest. "Because I used to be Marshal Jack Morrison," he said calmly, "and I still remember how to uphold the law." It was a bluff, of course. Jack had never been a marshal, had barely even been a deputy. But the star had belonged to his father, and desperation made him reach for any authority that might give these children a chance. Pierce studied him with new interest, uncertainty flickering in his cold eyes. "Marshal Morrison died in Kansas 5 years ago," he said slowly, "shot down in a gunfight with the Dalton gang." "Funny thing about dying," Jack replied, coughing slightly, "sometimes it don't take." The lie hung between them like smoke, and Jack could see Pierce calculating odds, weighing risks. A dead lawman was one thing, a living one, even a sick one, carried complications that might not be worth the trouble. But before Pierce could respond, the cabin door creaked open, and Thomas stepped out into the fading daylight, his young face set with determination that broke Jack's heart. "Don't hurt him," the boy said, his voice shaken but resolute. "If you want us, we'll come. Just don't hurt the man who showed us kindness." The words hit Jack like a physical blow. This child, barely 12 years old, was prepared to sacrifice himself and his siblings to protect a stranger who'd given them 3 days of shelter. It was a nobility that shamed every selfish decision Jack had ever made, a courage that put his lifetime a-running to shame. Mary and Ruth appeared behind their brother, holding little Samuel between them, their faces pale but determined. They stood together like a small army, prepared to march into hell rather than see their protector harmed. Pierce's eyes lit up with predatory satisfaction. "Well now," he purred, "that makes things simpler. Children, you just walk over here real slow-like, and nobody needs to get hurt." But as the children took their first hesitant steps toward the riders, something unexpected happened. Jack Morrison, dying cowboy and lifelong coward, finally found his courage. "The hell they will," he said, and drew his gun with speed that surprised everyone present, including himself. The Colt appeared in his hand like magic, its barrel trained steady on Pierce's chest, despite the tremor in Jack's wasted muscles. "These children are under my protection now," he continued, his voice carrying the authority of absolute conviction. "Any man who wants them will have to go through me first." Pierce's hand moved toward his own weapon, but Jack's gun never wavered. "I wouldn't," Jack advised quietly. "I may be dying, but my aim's still true, and a dying man's got nothing left to lose except his soul, and I already lost that a long time ago." The prairie fell silent except for the whisper of wind through grass and the nervous snorting of horses. 8 armed men sat frozen in their saddles, suddenly uncertain about a situation that had seemed so straightforward moments before. Jack could feel the tuberculosis burning in his lungs, could taste the copper tang of blood in his mouth, but his gun hand remained steady as granite. "Here's what's gonna happen," he continued, his voice carrying across the silence like a judge pronouncing sentence. "You men are gonna mount up and ride out of here. You're gonna forget you ever saw these children, and if I ever hear of you bothering orphans again, I'll hunt you down personally." Pierce's face twisted with rage. "You're bluffing. One man can't stop all of us." "Maybe not," Jack admitted, "but I can sure as hell take you with me. Question is, are 4 starving children worth dying for?" It was the moment of truth, the instant when all the pretense and posturing would give way to brutal reality. Jack could see the calculations racing through Pierce's mind, weighing profit against risk, cruelty against survival. The other riders shifted nervously, suddenly aware that their easy prey had grown teeth and claws. But before anyone could make a move, the sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed across the prairie, growing louder by the second. All eyes turned toward the horizon, where another group of riders was approaching fast, their dust cloud dark against the setting sun. Jack's heart sank. More of Pierce's men, arriving to tip the odds even further against him and the children. But as the new arrivals drew closer, Jack realized these weren't reinforcements for Pierce. The riders wore the blue uniforms of the United States Cavalry, their brass buttons glinting in the fading light. At their head rode a young lieutenant with the bearing of a man accustomed to command, his eyes taking in the scene with professional assessment. Pierce cursed under his breath, his moment of advantage evaporating like morning dew. The cavalry patrol reined in their horses in a cloud of dust, the lieutenant's gaze moving from Jack's drawn weapon to the children huddled by the cabin door, to Pierce's men arranged like predators around a kill. "What's the situation here?" the lieutenant asked, his voice carrying the crisp authority of military training. Jack kept his gun trained on Pierce, but addressed the officer. "These men are trying to kidnap children," he said simply. "I'm trying to stop them." Pierce straightened in his saddle, putting on a mask of injured innocence. "Lieutenant, this man is interfering with the lawful collection of debts. These children were put up as collateral by their deceased parents." It was a smooth lie, delivered with the confidence of a man who'd talked his way out of trouble before. But the lieutenant wasn't buying it. He'd seen enough frontier predators to recognize the type, and Pierce's men had the look of hired guns rather than legitimate debt collectors. "Is that true?" the officer asked Jack, who felt the weight of the moment settling on his shoulders like a lead blanket. Everything depended on his next words, on his ability to convince this young soldier that 4 orphan children deserved protection from the wolves circling them. "Lieutenant," Jack said, his voice steady despite the fire in his lungs, "I was a lawman for 20 years before this sickness took me. I know the difference between justice and predation." He paused, letting that sink in before continuing. "These children's parents died of cholera. They've been walking for days, starving and lost. When they came to my door, I gave them food and shelter like any Christian man would do. Now these vultures want to claim them as property." The lieutenant studied the scene with growing understanding. The children's obvious terror, their ragged condition, the way they instinctively shrank from Pierce's men. It all painted a clear picture of who the real victims were. "Do you have documentation for this alleged debt?" he asked Pierce, his tone suggesting he already knew the answer. Pierce's confident facade began to crack. "The paperwork was destroyed in the cholera outbreak," he said quickly. "But I assure you, Lieutenant, these children legally belong to us." "Legally?" The lieutenant's voice carried a note of skepticism. "Under what jurisdiction? This is federal territory, subject to U.S. law. And U.S. law doesn't recognize children as collateral for debt." Jack felt a surge of hope, but he kept his gun trained on Pierce. knowing cornered animals were the most dangerous. The other riders were growing increasingly nervous, their hands moving closer to their weapons as their easy score turned into a potential confrontation with federal authority. Thomas stepped forward, his young voice carrying clearly across the tense silence. "Please, sir," he said to the lieutenant, "we never saw these men before they came to our settlement. They ain't debt collectors. They're the ones who burned out the families that tried to resist them." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Pierce's face went white, then red with rage. "That's a lie," he snarled. "You can't believe the word of some orphan brat." But the lieutenant was already studying Pierce's men with new eyes, noting their nervous fidgeting, their guilty expressions, the way they avoided direct eye contact. These weren't lawful debt collectors, they were predators who'd been caught in the act. "I think we've heard enough,"
our lieutenant said firmly. "Pierce, you and your men will mount up and ride out. Now, if I see you in this territory again, you'll be arrested for attempted kidnapping and child endangerment." Pierce's hand moved toward his gun, desperation making him reckless. "You can't prove nothing," he growled. "It's our word against theirs." "Actually," Jack said quietly, his weapon still steady despite the tremor in his voice, "it's your word against mine, and I've got 8 federal witnesses to back me up." The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring. Pierce's men looked to their leader, waiting for orders, but Jack could see the doubt in their eyes. They'd signed on to intimidate a sick old man and steal some children. They hadn't bargained on facing down the U.S. cavalry. Slowly, reluctantly, Pierce raised his hands in surrender. "This ain't over," he said, his voice thick with menace. "We'll be back." "No," the lieutenant said with quiet authority, "you won't. Because if you set foot in federal territory again, you'll be shot on sight as enemies of the United States government." Pierce and his men wheeled their horses around and rode away, their dust cloud marking their retreat across the darkening prairie. Jack watched them go, his gun still drawn until they disappeared over the horizon. Only then did he allow himself to lower the weapon, his arms shaking with exhaustion and the after effects of adrenaline. The lieutenant dismounted and approached, his young face filled with respect for the older man. "That was well done, Marshal," he said formally. "Though I have to ask, I don't have any record of a Marshal Morrison in this territory." Jack managed a weak smile, blood speckling his lips as he coughed. "That's because there ain't one," he admitted. "I'm just a dying cowboy who couldn't stomach the thought of children being hurt." The officer's expression shifted from respect to something deeper, admiration for a man who'd been willing to bluff death itself to protect the innocent. "What's your real story?" he asked gently. Jack looked at the children, who were watching him with eyes full of gratitude and something that might have been love. For the first time in his adult life, he felt like he might actually deserve such regard. "My name's Jack Morrison," he said simply, "and I reckon I just found out what I want to be when I grow up." The lieutenant smiled at that, understanding passing between them like a shared secret. "Well, Jack Morrison," he said, "what do you plan to do with 4 orphan children?" It was the question Jack had been dreading and hoping for in equal measure. The answer would determine not just their fate, but the meaning of his own remaining days on Earth. Jack looked at the children standing before him, Thomas with his premature dignity, Mary and Ruth clinging to each other, little Samuel reaching up to take his hand with absolute trust. These weren't just 4 lost souls seeking shelter. They were his chance at redemption, his opportunity to build something lasting before the tuberculosis claimed him. "Lieutenant," he said, his voice stronger than it had been in weeks, "I'm gonna do what I should have done 20 years ago. I'm gonna stop running and start building." The officer nodded approvingly.
Will you be able to care for them? Your illness? Jack coughed, tasting blood, but his eyes remained clear and determined. I've got maybe 2 months left, he said honestly. But in that time, I can teach them what they need to survive. I can find them a good family in town, make sure they're placed together. Most importantly, I can show them that sometimes the world produces people willing to fight for what's right. Thomas stepped forward, his young face serious beyond his years. Mr. Jack, he said, we don't want to be a burden if you're sick. Son, Jack interrupted gently, taking care of you four is the first thing I've done in 40 years that actually matters. You're not a burden, you're a blessing. The lieutenant watched this exchange with growing understanding. I can arrange for supplies, he offered. Food, medicine, whatever you need. And I'll make sure word gets back to Fort Collins about your situation. There are good families there looking to adopt. Jack felt a weight lifting from his chest that had nothing to do with his disease. For the first time since his diagnosis, he wasn't thinking about death. He was thinking about legacy. Over the following weeks, Jack's cabin transformed once again. The children brought life to every corner, their laughter echoing off walls that had known only silence for months. Thomas proved himself a quick learner, absorbing Jack's lessons about farming, fish, and frontier survival with the desperate intensity of someone who knew these skills might mean the difference between life and death. The girls helped tend the garden and learned to preserve food for winter, their natural domestic instincts blossoming under Jack's patient guidance. Even little Samuel contributed, his innocent joy reminding them all that childhood could survive even in the harshest circumstances. Jack found himself fighting harder against his illness, rationing his strength more carefully, taking the laudanum only when the pain became unbearable. The children needed him alert and present, and he refused to waste his remaining time in an opium haze. He wrote letters to the lieutenant, arranging for the children's future, identifying potential adoptive families, ensuring their education would continue. But most importantly, he tried to show them through his actions what it meant to live with honor and courage. The cough was getting worse, blood more frequent. But Jack had never felt more alive, teaching Thomas to read from his father's old Bible, watching Mary and Ruth learn to cook his grandmother's recipes, holding Samuel during his nightmares. These simple acts of care filled him with a purpose he'd never known existed. He realized now that his coffin, still unfinished in the corner of his workshop, had been premature. He wasn't dying anymore. He was finally learning how to live. But most remarkably of all, the children weren't just surviving under his care. They were healing, their laughter growing more frequent, their nightmares less severe, their trust in the world slowly rebuilding under the patient care of a man who'd found his calling in the twilight of his life. As autumn painted the prairie in shades of gold and crimson, representatives from 3 different families arrived at Jack's cabin, each hoping to provide homes for the orphan children. But when they saw how the children had bonded, not just with each other, but with their dying guardian, they understood this was no ordinary placement. The Hendersons, a childless couple from town, had initially come hoping to adopt just one child. Instead, they found themselves volunteering to take all 4, recognizing that separating them would be an act of cruelty. "We've got a big house and bigger hearts," Mrs. Henderson said, tears in her eyes as she watched Jack teaching Samuel to whittle. "These children belong together, and if that old cowboy could sacrifice for them, so can we." Jack felt a profound gratitude that went beyond words. The children would stay together, remain a family, grow up with love and opportunity he'd never known. But more than that, they would carry forward the lessons he'd taught them about courage, kindness, and the importance of standing up for those who couldn't protect themselves. On their last evening together, Jack gathered the children around his fireplace for one final lesson. "I want you to remember something," he said, his voice harsh but determined. "I spent most of my life running from responsibility, from caring about people, from anything that might hurt me. But these past months with you four have been the best of my entire life. Not because I saved you, but because you saved me." Thomas, now tall for his age and bearing the confidence of a young man who'd faced real danger and survived, spoke for all of them. "We'll never forget you, Mr. Jack, and we'll never forget what you taught us about being brave." Jack smiled, feeling a peace he'd never expected to find. His coffin sat forgotten in the corner, no longer needed. He would face whatever time remained with the knowledge that his life had mattered, that 4 children would carry his values into the future, that love had finally conquered his lifelong fear of attachment. Winter found Jack Morrison weaker but not defeated, surrounded by letters from the children who wrote him regularly from their new home in town. The Hendersons kept their promise, treating all 4 as their own, while ensuring Jack remained part of their extended family. Thomas was excelling in school, Mary had discovered a talent for music, Ruth was learning to teach younger children, and Samuel spoke of Jack as his hero. The tuberculosis continued its relentless advance, but Jack faced it without fear now. He'd accomplished something greater than mere survival. He'd discovered the transformative power of selfless love. When spring came, bringing with it news that Pierce and his men had been arrested by federal marshals in Colorado Territory, Jack felt the final piece of his redemption fall into place. The children were safe, their future secure, their childhood restored by the simple act of one man choosing courage over cowardice in his final days. As he sat on his porch watching the sunset paint the prairie in shades of hope, Jack Morrison understood that his greatest victory hadn't been facing down 8 armed men. It had been opening his heart to 4 lost souls who taught him that dying with purpose was infinitely better than living without it. His coffin remained unfinished, a reminder that sometimes our carefully laid plans must give way to life's greater calling. But this was only the beginning of a legacy that would defy generations, inspiring 4 children to grow into adults who would pass on the lessons of courage, compassion, and sacrifice to their own families. Jack Morrison, the lonest cowboy who thought he was building his own coffin, had instead constructed something far more enduring, a bridge between despair and hope that would carry forward long after his name was forgotten. Would you have risked everything for 4 starving children who appeared at your door? Subscribe for more powerful stories like this, and click on the video on the screen to watch the next one with a twist so powerful you'll never forget it.